Hey everybody, this is Mark Pizzata, and we are here to take a look at 4 steps that you can do to improve your inferences. Now, if you haven't seen our previous video on making better inferences, then you'll want to check that out. But in that video, we talked about evidence and complexity of thought as 2 factors when looking at trying to improve our inferences, and we're going to be using that framework here as we take a look at how to improve our inferences. Because we're doing some inferences, then we're going to need some reading materials, so I grabbed this unit from the C3 teachers about the gender wage gap, and specifically grabbed one of the charts from this unit. And the first thing I do when I take a look at a chart is I take a look at the title. And in this case, we've got one that takes a look at women's median annual earnings as a percentage of men's median annual earnings for full-time year-round employment. Before we start working on inferences, I did a quick mind map just to kind of map out some of the different parts about the gender wage gap that I knew, some questions I had, some things I knew about it, some of my experiences, and some of my connections, and some of those we'll be using in a little bit here. So just based off of the title of this chart, I'm going to make an educated guess or inference that women don't make as much as men. And I'm going to use my personal experience to help me out with that, and that included my mom not making as much as my dad did for basically doing the same job. So now that we've got our inference, we're going to move on to the first step, which is adding some evidence from the text. So let's take a look at the full graph. And what you're going to see on here is a line, and on the left hand side it says 57%, and on the right hand side it says 78%. And along the y-axis we've got a set of percentages, and along the x-axis we've got some years. And so from this I can make the inference that 78% was the amount that women made compared to men when it came to their annual earnings in 2013. Now let's go ahead and add that into our inference, and I'm just going to add that to the top and say that according to the American Association of University Women, and I'm going to put a date on there to cite it, and pretty much going to leave the rest because the inference still stands. Now notice with just this one thing how much better this inference is. We've got some authoritative source here that really backs up what that inference was. And this definitely adds a lot to our inference just because we've added this piece to it. But to be honest with you, I'm still not very happy with it. And it's because this inference, although now we've got some evidence for it that backs it up, it's still pretty
elementary, my dear Watson.
And definitely needs a boost to the complexity of thinking involved in the inference. And now we're on step 2, which is being more specific with our inference, and this is going to help us increase that complexity of thinking. One of the things that we were able to pull out of that chart wasn't just that women don't make as much as men, but we could be a little bit more specific with that. And in particular, we can take a look at the year 2013 when women only made 78% of what a man did on an annual basis. So that moves us on to step 3, which is taking a look at other sources. And so we're going to go ahead and take a look at what would be another source that we could use to back up our claim here, or perhaps add a little bit more specificity to what we were doing. So I found another chart. This one takes a look at women's earnings as a percentage of men's based off of their hourly and weekly earnings as well. And you'll notice we got some different numbers there. So let's take a look at how we can increase the strength of our evidence by incorporating this other source. So one of the first things I do is change that first sentence, and you'll see that what that does is it shows my understanding that the gender gap is not necessarily something that's straightforward. It's not just more or less, but rather there's a lot more complexity to it. Now I'm going to keep my citation from the AAUW, but in this case what I'm going to do is I'm going to show a little bit more specificity about how much the gender gap has changed over time. So I've added the fact that it was over 40 years, but that in 2013 we're still talking about a 78% increase in annual earnings. Now this next section I am going to include some of the information that I got from my other source, and I'm going to explain a little bit more about taking a look at how the weekly and hourly earnings percentages really kind of makes it a little bit more complex to talk about the gender gap, and I'm going to cite that source as well. Now already we have a much better inference than what we started with. So there's a lot of different ways that I could have gone to increase that complexity of thought. For example, I could have taken a look at how we have institutional sexism and the impact that that might have on the gender wage gap. But since I started with a personal connection with my mom, I decided to take a more psychological look at the gender gap. And the inference that I'm going to make here is taking a look at how perhaps part of the reason why we've got this gender gap is because there's an internal struggle in women in terms of the pressure that they have on responsibility towards family, as well as the responsibility that they have in their work life. Now, if we compare our final inference with what we started with, you'll definitely notice that we've got an inference with much stronger evidence, as well as a lot more depth of complexity in its thought. And that's exactly what these 4 steps are going to do for you. We could always go back and repeat these 4 steps. We could take a look at other evidence sources. We can take a look at maybe expanding some of our thought process and how we see the gender gap and what inferences we might be able to make about why there is a gender gap. But overall, this process is definitely going to help you be able to improve your inferences from start to finish. Thanks for joining us. If you thought the video was helpful, hit that like button, share it with a friend. Go ahead and add your comments below, or you can always join us at thelearningframework.com for more resources and videos.